Welcome to our first program of the year. Thank you all for joining us. As many of you know, I'm Matthew Silverman, the director of the Hoberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture with Professor Hoberman, who will be discussing Myths, Legends, and Monuments, the Popular Legacy of Early American Jewish History. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, a moment that has prompted reflection across the country on the stories we tell about America and how they shape our national identity. In that spirit, tonight's program is especially timely as it invites us to explore the understandings of early American Jewish history. I would like to extend my thanks to the Capitol Jewish Museum for partnering with us. I highly recommend a visit to this incredible institution located in downtown DC at 3rd and F Streets Northwest. On March 6th, the new special exhibition, Blacklisted, An American Story, will open. This compelling exhibition examines the intersections of politics, anti-Semitism, freedom of speech, and national security during the Red Scare of the 1950s. A special thank you to Rachel and Eddie Eiches for generously sponsoring this program. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Winter 2026 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Our next program is Echoes of Old New York, the Black Jewish Musical Connection, with Saul Lilienstein 2 weeks from tonight. Saul has spoken for the Institute a number of times and always shares beautiful music and fascinating stories. I highly recommend you joining us. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep them concise and incomplete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you could submit them at any point during the presentation. As with most of our lectures, this one is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Michael Hoberman is a professor of American literature at Fitchburg State University and the author of several books on Jewish history in the United States, including New Israel, New England, Jews and Puritans in Early America, 100 Acres of America, The Geography of Jewish American Literary History, and Imagining Early American Jews, which was just published in October 2025 by Oxford University Press. Beginning this semester, Professor Hoberman will serve as a fellow at the Katz Center of Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is completing a book about Theodore Solomons, the San Francisco-born Jew who created the John Muir Trail. And with that, I now welcome Professor Hoberman to join us.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Haberman Center. Thank you for the people who contributed for tonight. In just a moment, I'll share my screen so you can see my slides. But in the meantime, I want to show you my beautiful office here at the Katz Center, which I just moved into a few days ago. I don't have any books yet. Now let me share the screen. I have some slides that I'll be presenting to you tonight with my talk. And of course, I know you'll let the organizers know if you're having trouble seeing them, but you should see what I've got to show you right now. I will begin by, first of all, I want to say, I'm going to say something about the title of the book. But before that, I want to also just let you know that I'm always interested in conversing with people about my writing and research. And at the end of my talk, I will show you, there'll be a final slide that has my email address on it. I welcome any of you to email me in the aftermath of the talk if you have comments or questions or just want to continue discussing this topic. With regard to the title of the book, I'll call your attention to the first word in it. That's maybe the most important of the words, of these 4 words. Imagining. And that's important because my book is not, I'm not offering new discoveries about early American Jewish history. That topic has been written about very skillfully and effectively, particularly in the last 25, 30 years. There are so many wonderful new books and so much great scholarship, archival scholarship on early Jewish American history. What my book is about how that history has been popularized, imagined, and very often through the years, through the decades, mythologized, turned into legendary. And I look at that because I think, in general, it's important for us to think about um, how we interpret history in the present and how our interpretations of history shift through time, right? So the way that American Jews might have interpreted early phases of their history 100 years ago are very different from how people looked at it 50 years ago and in the present. And that happens in accordance with all kinds of cultural and social and political changes in the nation. But again, imagining is really what this book is about, how early Jewish American history has been imagined, particularly by fiction writers, by museum curators, and as you'll see in the final section of my talk, by the family members, the living descendants of these early Jewish American families. I will say something about the cover image, but I'll save that for the end. I want to keep you guessing. Why are you looking at a picture of a synagogue through somebody's iPhone? Well, I'll hopefully keep you guessing and thinking about that, but I will address that question towards the end. And if I forget to, somebody hopefully will remind me to do so. All right, so starting here with something fairly topical and timely. Many of you are probably aware that in the last few months there have been, I don't know, two or three of these No King's Day marches in various parts of the United States. And the reason I start with this image is because, as you can see, this marcher, this protester, is invoking, and the entire idea of No King's Day is an invocation of early American history. Which is to say, and again, to relate it back to the subject of my talk, what I'm interested in is how people in the present, how we in the present take early American history, and particularly Jewish American history, and interpret it in accordance with our needs in the present. So, in the resistance movement that's underway right now, there are reasons why people invoke the history and legacy of the American Revolution, reasons that extend beyond the 250th anniversary that Matt mentioned, to the idea of monarchy having been overthrown, and so forth. Now, these invocations take various forms, right? Invocations of early American history take various forms. Another sort of recent example of that is the 1619 project, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, which in 2019 was a project undertaken by particularly journalists and artists and photographers and documentarians and writers and so on, historians, to try to reshape and re-understand early American history and the establishment of the American Republic through the lens of what occurred in 1619, which was the sale of the first enslaved people in Virginia. So this is, again, an example of how, outside of the Jewish sphere in particular, how American people look back at their early past to try to understand the present, right? The 1619 project, among other things, was an attempt to understand the racial animosities and racial tensions that existed in, and obviously still exist in the country in 2026. Now, these invocations of early American history, I guess I've shown you examples of two invocations of early American history that you might associate with the political left. But of course, the political right is just as frequently doing this. And without taking a position here, just this slide is intended to just remind us all of the fact that there are people at all ends of the political spectrum who care about American history, who want to interpret American history, particularly its earliest phases, and do so for various ideological, social, cultural reasons that align with their worldview. The comment that I've typed up on the right-hand side is not really worthy of my, you can interpret it for yourself, but this is an example. I think this Doug Wilson is a current a current commentator on the Christian nationalist right. Again, an invocation of Charleston in 1850 for the purpose of exclaiming some sort of racial ideas that this person carries today. Now, let's bring it into the Jewish sphere. Jews have been interpreting American and American Jewish history, I think we can say for sure, since 1800. Maybe earlier, but this document that you see in front of you on the left-hand side is the first documented instance that I know of an American Jew framing Jewish American history, looking at Jewish American history through a communal lens, through the lens of 1800, in this case, in order to better understand America at that time, which, by the way, the early part of the 19th century, the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, was as politically tumultuous, I dare say, as our time is now. So perhaps it wasn't a coincidence that a Jewish American would have taken a look at in the year 1800 and tried to interpret early phases of Jewish history in order to better understand the situation that he and his fellow Jews were in. Now, let me tell you more about this. What you're looking at is a commencement address that was given by a man named Samson Simpson. This person went on, if you perhaps have heard of him, he went on to found Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. He's the first known Jewish graduate of Columbia College. And in 1800, he was invited to deliver a commencement speech at Columbia. He was one of about a dozen people who gave commencement speeches that day. Back then, at American colleges, there would be a dozen or even sometimes 20 commencement speeches given by various members of the graduating class. And many of these speeches were delivered in languages other than English, particularly in Latin, Greek, and in this instance, in Hebrew. Now, what you see on the left-hand side is the English version of the speech, and I believe that the speech was originally written in English and then translated into Hebrew. Columbia was one of the colleges, the early colleges in North America where Hebrew was taught, primarily for the use of potential ministers in the Protestant churches. But in this case, the Hebrew was read by an actual Jew, a practicing Jew. Now, Samson Simpson didn't write the speech himself. It was written for him by a man named Gershom Mendes Satius. I will speak more about this person. He will come up in my story a little bit further on tonight. But in any case, what this speech did, it was very short. Probably didn't take more than about 3 to 5 minutes for him to declaim in Hebrew. But the content of the speech was essentially a recapping of the history of Jews in North America up to 1800. And when this Satius, who was the leader of the Sharith Israel Synagogue in New York, when he wrote the speech, apparently he had access to enough archival material that he was able to say, and our evidence today concurs with this, that Jews first came to North America in 1650s and settled. In his case, he spoke about Jews in New York, in the city of New York. And it doesn't, I think it wasn't coincidental here that in 1800, there wasn't just a politically tumultuous time that might have merited a speech, sort of a retrospective speech about Jewish history in America at a politically dangerous time. It also happened to be the eve of the 200th anniversary of Henry Hudson's quote unquote discovery of New York, and the state of New York, the city of New York, was about to celebrate its bicentennial. And here was a member of the small Jewish community in the city of New York, making a claim for Jews having been participants in early New York, going back to the days of New Amsterdam. The image on in the right-hand corner, by the way, is of Columbia College at this time, which is where, well, the speech was actually given in St. Paul's Chapel, which you can still see in Lower Manhattan, and Columbia College was adjacent to it at that time. Now, let's advance the clock roughly 100 years. We're looking again at an example of a Jewish American interpretation of early Jewish American history. In this case, we're looking at a book that's published in I have to put my reading glasses on. I think it says 1893, but maybe it says 1895. Simon Wolf was well assimilated American Jew of German descent. And in 1895, he publishes this book, The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. The book makes various claims, but its primary content is taken up with essentially it's a long roster of every man who served in a war in America, going back to the 7 Years' War, what some people call the French and Indian War. So from that war to the Revolutionary War, to the War of 1812, the Mexican War, all of the conflicts up to 1895. And I guess what I want to talk about is why he published the book. So, of course, as many of you know, in the 1890s, we're at a height of an enormous Jewish influx, mostly from Eastern Europe to places like the Lower East Side. And non-Jewish Americans, some of them at least, are discomfited by this massive influx of seemingly alien Jewish immigrants. And for that matter, assimilated Jews like Simon Wolf and Jews whose families had been here even longer than his, some of whom we'll be talking about further in the talk tonight, they too were perhaps a little bit uncomfortable and discomfited by this enormous influx. And so the idea here was to assert the Americanness and also the eligibility to be American of Jews, right? This book was essentially trying to make the case that Americans need not have any anxiety that Jews coming here wouldn't fit in because look, all of the generations of Jews who preceded them served the nation loyally and faithfully in all of its conflicts. So that's a little bit about that book. And again, this is 1895. Incidentally, the American Jewish Historical Society is founded in 1892. So these are roughly adjacent. And the purpose of that organization was a similar one to the purpose that shaped Simon Wolf's book. All right, now we're jumping ahead to a period of time that I can remember, and perhaps many of you can remember, and that is the bicentennial. We're coming on the 250th, but the bicentennial in 1976 was a momentous event for many Americans, Jews and non-Jews. And during the bicentennial, among other things, the U.S. Postal Service issued this stamp commemorating Haim Solomon. My sense, I was a sort of a preteen during the bicentennial period, but I remember learning about Haim Solomon at my Hebrew school in New York City. Again, I think it was in connection with the bicentennial, and the idea was, well, we as up and coming American Jews in the 1970s needed to be reminded and assured that we were not aliens to this country, but that we had been preceded by loyal Americans such as Haim Solomon. All kinds of stories, probably before the bicentennial, are hatched about Haim Solomon. He becomes a mythological figure in Jewish American history. One of my favorite stories about him, this is before the bicentennial, and I can't remember where I encountered this, but there's a story about him, complete fabrication, to my understanding, which is that at some point, so Haim Solomon, of course, what we know is that he helped he loaned money to the Continental Congress. But as the story goes that I remember hearing, George Washington's troops are camped at Valley Forge. They're starving to death. They need money for ammunition and food. And George Washington comes into Philadelphia and knocks on Haim Solomon, looks for Haim Solomon, and Haim Solomon isn't to be found in his home because he's at the shul. It happens to be Yom Kippur. I don't think there's an ounce of truth to this story, but what I like about it is that it tells us two things. First of all, that the people who told the story, wanted listeners to have an idea that Haim Solomon and George Washington are sort of chums with each other. And second of all, that Haim Solomon was a loyal enough American that he would be willing to loan this money to George Washington. And finally, that he was a loyal enough Jew that he was in the shul when he should have been on Yom Kippur. So that's an example of sort of a prime example of a legend that develops around a Jewish American hero of the Revolutionary War period. Again, this isn't to say that Haim Solomon didn't do many of the things that we know he did, but a whole separate species of popular legend crops up around figures like this for ideological reasons. Now, to bring it a little bit to a sort of a more niche interest, We have interest, particularly among Jewish American Southerners, particularly in the period preceding the civil rights movement. But I will say that the book whose cover I'm displaying here, this book was published in 2000. And I'll let you judge the cover for yourself. I'm not going to say anything about this illustration. It's actually a pretty more than adequate history of Jews who served in the Confederate Army. But I call it to your attention just as an example of sort of Jewish American commemoration of Jews serving in the Confederacy, and in so doing, allowing Jews in the South, at least, to claim loyalty to their home states, loyalty to what we now, sort of universally historians refer to as the lost cause of the Confederacy. You can see that this is becoming, it has the potential, and certainly in this instance, has great potential to be politically fraught and problematic. But that's what happens when history is popularized. That's often what does occur. Um, a similar mythology, if there's a mythology around loyal Jewish Confederates, there's also a mythology that develops certainly in the early part of the 20th century, right up through most of the 20th century, a mythology about Jews on the frontier. Now, I can only claim so much with regard to mythology here because this is actually a photograph. And what you're seeing here on the right, very right-hand side, the man in the great coat, there is a man named Solomon Bibo, who was a German-born Jew who came to the Southwest in the 1880s and actually served as the governor of the Acoma Pueblo for a period of time, maybe a year or so, married into the Pueblo tribe. Again, there's an interest on the part of Jewish Americans, particularly in the middle part of the 20th century, in recognizing, well, the frontier, what could be more American than the frontier? And Jews were there, right? What could be more American than the Civil War? And Jews were there. So that's part of how these mythologies develop. But again, these issues get fraught and are politically complicated. And as time has passed, as time passes, people's views and ideas change. And so, what perhaps people were once proud of, Jewish gunslingers on the Western frontier, maybe we're not so sanguine about that idea now. Now, I think the beginning of a shift occurs in the way these mythologies are treated, and around the period of the civil rights movement during the Vietnam War. My next clip is actually a video clip, and hopefully this will work. This is going to be familiar to almost all of you. You'll have to forgive that might be about 5 seconds of ads we have to get through. But I think you'll enjoy this little comical, but also sort of pertinent interlude as a way to get you thinking about how Jews on the Western frontier, the potential it has not only to be mythologized, but also to be turned into parody, which is what happens when Mel Brooks touches anything.
Start the year strong at Planet Fitness. Just $1 down,
You have to
$15
get
a
through
month.
the ad
Cancel
first.
anytime. Deal ends January 9th.
There's a Harbor Freight in your neighborhood where we make hardworking tools that work with any pro or DIY.
Now you tell me your story. What's a dazzling urbanite like you doing in a rustic setting like this?
If you really must pry.
Oh, I must.
Well, back in '56, my folks and I were part of this long wagon train moving west. Well, not exactly part of it. You might say we was bringing up the rear when suddenly, from out of the west, came the entire Sioux Nation. And let me tell you, baby, they was open for business. Actually, the white folks didn't let us travel in their circle, so we made our own. Schwarzes. No, no, seid nicht mit Sugar. Laws im Gain! Kappa walk, it's all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be gesehen. Take off.
Sorry, I need
And
to
the
start this
rest?
off. All right, I want to say just a couple things about that Mel Brooks to put it in context before I go to a much more serious subject here. So first of all, obviously, inserting the Yiddish-speaking Indian chief is one way that Mel Brooks plays around with the whole idea of Jews on the frontier. That's fascinating. It's also interesting to me, and really, I guess I would say to Mel Brooks's credit, that he introduces racial complexity to the frontier, which in the American mythologies, typically there is no racial complexity. It's a white environment, where the enemies are the Indians and the good guys are the white people. And Brooks just messes with that whole scenario completely, and then interjects a Jewish element there. All right, now when you get to this period of the 1960s, 1970s, post-civil rights, it seems to me that one thing that happens is that American Jews perhaps lose a connection to their own history as Americans, and in some ways, perhaps mostly inadvertently, forms of Jewish identity in the United States borrow heavily from basically make strong invocations of two other spheres of Jewish influence, one of which is the Holocaust awareness. So, in other words, if you polled American Jews in the 1970s about, their sense of identity as Jews, very often, and post 1970s, very often the Holocaust would be invoked as sort of a major piece of the Jewish legacy, including for American Jews. Now, that I don't want to delegitimize that, but I would point out the fairly obvious point that the Holocaust did not happen in America, and by and large, it didn't happen to American Jews. So one result of the raising of Holocaust consciousness among American Jews is a loss of connection to American history, which is where Jews seem sometimes to forget that they actually have a stake. And the other example there, it won't surprise you, the other sphere of influence over Jewish American cultural and identity, of course, is Israel. Again, Pew polls and so on will tell you that particularly during the later decades of the 20th century and into the first part of the 21st century, that many American Jews' sense of Jewish identity is yoked very closely to a sense of connection to Israel. Again, I don't have a problem with that. However, both Holocaust awareness and affinity for Israel are ways, perhaps inadvertently, of losing a connection to America. And as my book argues, Jews have been in America going back to the 1600s. It's important for us to engage our identity as Americans as well as our identity as Israel identified or Holocaust commemorating people. Now I get into the material itself. What does my book talk about? And I want to start here with an example a story that many of you may know, but some of you perhaps don't know. This is maybe my best example of an event, or you might almost say a non-event, but let's call it an event for the time being, an event in early Jewish American history that really lends itself to mythology and imagination. This is a prime example of a situation where something that actually happened or was supposed to have happened and didn't really happen, as I'll explain, became the subject, particularly recently, like in the last 25 years, launched a whole bunch of sort of speculative novels, for instance, because it's just such a bizarre event. So the event is as follows. The man you see on the left-hand side, Mordecai Emanuel Noah, was a New York-based politician, journalist, playwright, and sort of a Jewish impresario. He was also briefly the ambassador to the Barbary States. the first American Jew to be appointed to such a position. In any case, in 1825, Mordecai Emanuel Noah basically with some other people purchased an island in just outside Buffalo, New York, Grand Island. The island is still there, with the idea, promoting the idea that this island would become a refuge for the world's refugee Jews. And he issued a declaration inviting Jews from all around the world to come and settle on this island. The politics of this are complicated because he really never did articulate whether this sort of mini Jewish state was going to be part of the United States or a separate entity or what have you. But at the very least, he issued the declaration. And on September 2nd, 1825, he held a ceremony in Buffalo. It turns out, as far as we know, I think he was the only Jew who attended that ceremony, although there were hundreds of other people who paraded through the streets of Buffalo to declare this city of refuge for the Jews. The stone that you see there is the cornerstone that they laid. So at the end of the day, they laid this cornerstone. You can still see the cornerstone at the Buffalo Museum of History. But Ararat, that was the name of this city of refuge, Ararat didn't make it to September 3rd, 1825. It was a non-event. It was a pageant, essentially. It was a show. It was a circus. It was a spectacle, and that kind of thing lends itself very well to works of the imagination. So very recently, as I say, 1998, I think, the American Jewish graphic novelist Ben Ketcher writes a graphic novel called The Jew of New York, which in a very bizarre way retells this story and makes spins off of it in all kinds of ways. Also, an Israeli novelist more recently publishes a book, a sort of speculative fiction book in which Mordecai Emanuel Noah actually marries a native woman on the island, and the Jews actually do come, and there is no need for the state of Israel. So all of that speculation is hatched by this, historical spectacle slash non-event. Again, the idea being that there's a lot in Jewish American history that imaginative writers can play around with if they want to. I'm going to focus for the rest of my talk on two other parts of the book. Part of my book does talk about historical fiction, and the Mordecai Emanuel Noah material pertains to that. But I'd rather, for our purposes tonight, I'm going to focus on basically two sections of the book, the first of which looks closely at how three historic synagogues are curated in the northeastern United States, and then I'll also talk about the genealogical dimension of my project. So one of the things that I was interested in writing about in imagining early American Jews was, again, I took, there are basically three historic synagogues. The only one that is actually the original building that the original synagogue was in, of course, is the Newport, Rhode Island synagogue, which I'll be speaking about in just a moment. But the other two are Sharith Israel in New York City and Mikveh Israel, which is right down the street from where I am here in Philadelphia at the moment. But that too, both Sharith Israel and Mikveh Israel are in modern buildings. The congregations are contiguous with the historical congregations. The buildings are new. So Sharith Israel, this would have been the first synagogue in North America, the first building. The congregation claims that its origins go back to the 1650s, when, as I mentioned before, the first Jews are known to have come to New Amsterdam. But the building itself, dates to 1730. Of course, it's long gone. The image that you see on the left-hand side, I'm very fond of this picture. I got on my bike last year, and I was determined to find where the synagogue was. I mean, you can, if you look at a map, you can figure it out. There's the plaque commemorating its location. What I love about it, of course, is that it's juxtaposed next to Luke's Lobster House. This is on what's now it used to be Mill Street. Now it's William Street in Lower Manhattan. However, so this is there is no remnant of the Mill Street building. That building long since evaporated. But Sharith Israel still exists, is a very prosperous congregation. Their synagogue, if I remember right, is on 69th Street and Central Park West. And if you visit it and you take the tour, as I did, one of the most interesting places that you will be led is to what they call the Little Synagogue, which is a small room within a much larger synagogue building and sanctuary. And the Little Synagogue contains relics from the earlier buildings. So all of the furnishings you see, the chandeliers, the Torah reading table, and so on. All of these items derive from some of them from Mill Street, some of them from the synagogues that the congregation had subsequently moving up the island of Manhattan through the decades from 1730 onward. Now, one of the most important ways, as I see it, that this community, let's say, commemorates its history, recapitulates its history, interprets its history for a popular audience, is through the idea of origin claims. So this is the oldest synagogue community in North America, and much of what they do to curate the building, to curate their furnishings, to tell their story online is basically connected to making this claim that we are the oldest synagogue. And that claim of being the oldest synagogue is important because it allows the synagogue to claim sort of institutional contiguity with some of the most important events in American history, going back to the founding of New Amsterdam, practically right up through the Revolutionary War and so on. And there are a couple things that members of the synagogue do to make the most of that connection. What I find to be particularly intriguing here, you see on the left, well, both photographs are taken the same place. So the synagogue is in Upper Manhattan. But the burial ground that was originally established for this community is in Chatham Square, which is basically now part of Chinatown. And on Memorial Day, many years, members of the synagogue community go particularly to lay wreaths on the graves, in particular of its oldest members, including several Revolutionary War veterans. And there's a color guard that's brought there. There are sometimes early American military reenactors that come there. And one of the most telling things for me, again, I don't really know exactly what to make of it, but cemeteries, of course, are enchanting places, places that really engage our imagination and our senses. And one of the reasons they do so is because they are, physical remnants, literally physical remnants of a departed time. And the idea that there are early American Jews buried on this land connects to the idea of Jews claiming longevity in North America, which again, for Sharith Israel, is the most important claim that we have been here all along. These longevity claims are legitimate in a certain, they're certainly historically legitimate, but I also wonder, I can't help speculating a little bit about ask the question, why should longevity claims matter given the principles of the American Revolution, which, after all, were asserting that really didn't matter where your people came from or where your people are buried, that, the connection to America is an ideological connection and a connection of belief and ideals as opposed to, I hate to use the phrase, as opposed to blood and soil. But there's always a tension when people commemorate history, and there's always the enticement to want to make longevity claims. And this seems to me to be one of the more interesting types of longevity claims. On the right-hand side, part of this ceremony, this is, I have to admit, I find this to be very moving here. The man on the left-hand side in the airman's uniform is a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. And his ancestors, right? So he's a member of Sharith Israel. His ancestors fought in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. They're buried in this cemetery. And I think when this photograph was taken in 2018, he was over 100 years old. So you can see that there's the pull of these longevity claims is difficult to resist. Now, we'll go to Newport, Rhode Island. This, of course, is the oldest synagogue building in North America. It's not the oldest synagogue in the New World, of course. There are older ones in the Caribbean. But this is the oldest building in North America that has had a Jewish congregation in it. The burial ground is right down the street. Interestingly, about the burial ground, we know from written records that many of the names of the Jews who are named in this stone here are buried there. That's what the record tells us. But interestingly enough, the nobody can find where these graves are to this day. The location, the exact location of these remains is unknown. So there's still a bit of a mystery to the Touro synagogue and its history and its claims. In the case of Touro, right, so for Shurith Israel, you have longevity. Touro synagogue is a slightly different situation here. I guess I'll go back to this slide because I want to talk a little bit more about a couple things here in connection with the synagogue's claims. So um, we know for sure that the first Jews who came to Newport came there as early as 1677. We know that because there was a deed for a burial ground in 1677. Some people, there is a shred of evidence, literally a shred, it's a scrap of paper that would suggest that Jews were there in 1658. Why it would matter that Jews were in Newport in the 1600s, right? Whether 1658 or 1677. Again, people want to be able to claim longevity, but more particularly in the case of Rhode Island, of course, the most influential person in Rhode Island's colonial history is Roger Williams, who many Americans think of as sort of the patriarch of religious tolerance and religious freedom. And so the idea that Jews and Roger Williams coincided is kind of compelling, except for the fact that Roger Williams had no interactions with any Jews, any actual Jews, and in what he wrote, mostly expressed hostility towards the Jews. Um, Another element that sort of puts Newport on the map in terms of commemoration and ways in which reasons for why it's such an important shrine for American Jews has to do with the very famous letter that George Washington wrote in 1790. Well, it was a thank you letter for a congratulatory letter that he received from Moses Seixas upon his inauguration as the first president of the United States. And the Washington letter, like the Memorial Day ceremony at Sharith Israel, there is a commemorative reading of the Washington letter most years at the outside the Touro synagogue. Because it is thought of as such a sort of touchstone for American Jewish history and the idea, again, of American Jewish contiguity, Jewish oneness with the American experiment. The museum on the left that you see here this is where most of the commemorative exhibits are. The sign on the right-hand side for Patriots Park is of interest to me. And again, this connects back to the idea of popularizing history and mythologizing it. It's Patriots Park is this little garden that from which you can see the synagogue, and the dedication to the park suggests that the park was recently created to commemorate those patriotic Jews who served the American cause during the American Revolutionary War. Now, this is interesting, and there's certainly some historical accuracy to it, but it leaves out the fact that approximately half of Newport's Jews, including the leader of the synagogue community during the Revolutionary War, were Tories, right? There is no park for the Tory Jews. There's a park for the Patriot Jews. So, we make when we commemorate history, we make deliberate choices. One last thing to say about the Newport Synagogue. Maybe this is for me, this is really the most compelling story of them all, and really a prime example of a legend being hatched. So in the synagogue itself, to look back at it, near the entrance of the building, there is a door in the floor that leads to a small sort of passageway underground. And of course, people have been aware that this little hiding space has existed for many years. Apparently, this was the sort of hiding space that many other synagogues, Sephardic synagogues throughout the Atlantic world featured pretty routinely. And so, the question is, why did they have a hiding space there? Did they actually imagine that they were going to be hounded out of a synagogue in Newport? Of course, that didn't happen. Maybe they did so in sort of symbolic recognition of their Sephardic heritage. But the story I want to tell is One that I came across, I was giving a talk maybe 4 or 5 years ago on early Jewish American history, including the Touro Synagogue. And somebody in the audience asked me, "Oh, is it true that that little hidden passageway was used, that Jews hid escaped slaves from the in the Underground Railroad in their synagogue?" I had never heard this before, and of course I looked into it and very quickly established that no, there were no such thing ever happened. But I did find a couple invocations of that exact story, published invocations. In other words, people had written popular, in recent years, like since the year 2000, had written books, sort of tourist books about the history of the Touro synagogue, making this claim that basically the Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews of Newport in the 19th century, because of their shared sense of having been oppressed, of having been chased out of Europe, they naturally gravitated towards wanting to help fugitive slaves to escape from slavery. The only problem with this story, as perhaps some of you are aware, is that basically by 1820, there were no Jews in Newport. And the Underground Railroad is a phenomenon from the mid 19th century. So there isn't an ounce of truth to this, but what there is the desire on the part of, let's say, contemporary American Jews to want to be aligned with the right side of history, right? If we had been there, we would have sheltered escaped slaves. I think the plausible explanation here, and how the story might have emerged, is that it's quite possible that escaped slaves were hidden in that area, but if so, it would have been by the Quakers who basically had the keys to the synagogue through most of the 19th century. Quakers were known to aid escaped slaves, particularly in New England, so that makes sense. And basically, after the Jews left Newport, mostly for economic reasons, literally they left the keys in the Quakers' hands. And so, for all we know, it was used as an escape hatch for Underground Railroad fugitives, but Jews had nothing to do with it. And whether or not Jews sympathized with escaping blacks is a matter for speculation. It's certainly not historically, we can't establish that as factual in any way. Now, the last synagogue I'll mention is the one that's right down the street from where I am right now. This is the modern building of Mikveh Israel. I want to move on quickly to my next category, but I'll just point out again. So if Sharith Israel's point of distinction is its longevity claim, and Newport claims to be sort of the birth of, the birthplace of American religious freedom via Roger Williams and George Washington. Well, Mikveh Israel's claim is that it is the synagogue of the American Revolution. And again, there is some legitimacy here, right? There are members of Mikveh Israel who were fought in under arms during the Revolutionary War. Haim Solomon was one of them. There's certainly some legitimacy to this claim, but the idea of it being the synagogue of the American Revolution is a contemporary overlay to history, a sort of a contemporary reinterpretation of history. And one interesting aspect here that you can connect back to this logo, right? So the logo, of course, is the Liberty Bell. And there was a story, again, this is in the category of sort of legendary. There was a story that emerged maybe 50 years ago, some basically errant interpretation of some documentation which suggested that the Liberty Bell itself had been delivered to Philadelphia on board a ship that was owned by Jewish ship owners. This is a very compelling story to tell in the period leading up to the bicentennial. The only problem with it is that it wasn't accurate, and we now know that the ship that delivered the Liberty Bell was not captained or owned by Jews at all. The ship's name was the Hibernia, which certainly does not seem like the name that a Jewish ship owner would give to a ship. But when it was revealed that in fact the Liberty Bell was not delivered by Jews to the city of Philadelphia, there was I found an op-ed, I think it was in the Philadelphia Inquirer, in the immediate aftermath of this news coming to light. And the person writing the op-ed said, well, yeah, okay, it's true that the Liberty Bell wasn't brought here on a Jewish ship. However, the inscription on the Liberty Bell derives from the Jewish Bible, from Leviticus. So there you go. It is a Jewish Liberty Bell after all. Okay, so I want to talk about genealogy for a little while and then get to our question period before long. So, the final chapter of my book looks at particularly how the living descendants of early American Jews have commemorated and celebrated the history of their families. This practice goes back certainly to certainly, I guess we could say, to that same period that of Simon Wolf, the turn of the 20th century. In 1935, you have this publication. It's a one-off publication called the St. Charles. This is sort of a blue book of early American Jews, Jewish families, a list of and a whole bunch of articles published for the benefit of the descendants of early American Jews, so they can find the names of their ancestors in here. It's called the St. Charles because at that time, in 1935, people thought this again was inaccurate, that the ship that brought those first Jews to New Amsterdam was called the St. Charles, and many writers at this time were referred to the St. Charles as the Jewish Mayflower. And so if your family members were on the Jewish Mayflower, well, you had a claim, of course. In the 1970s, of course, genealogy takes off as a popular pastime and practice. This book on the right-hand side by Dan Rottenberg is sort of the Bible of Jewish genealogy for American Jews. 1969, 1970 or so, the book on the left by Stephen Birmingham comes out. It's basically a very gossipy study of the living descendants of these early American Sephardim, the people he calls the grandees. I interviewed, I'll talk in just a minute about people I interviewed, and one or two of them said that, this book had a very honored place on their family's bookshelf because it was basically owning this book and looking through its pages was very exciting. You could find your family represented in, again, sort of the equivalent of a blue book. If you go to the DAR website in current days, you will see that the DAR, the famous DAR that forbade Marian Anderson from singing at the Lincoln Memorial, well, that same DAR now has a page for researching your Jewish patriot. Of course, they also have a page. Well, I shouldn't say, of course, there's a page for researching your African American patriot. The idea is that, early American history is anyone's to claim. If you can, if you can document your story, you're legitimate. All right. Now, what I did in order to prepare this final chapter of my book is that I searched around and was able to track down about a dozen people who are living descendants of early American Jews. And that was by far the most exciting and rewarding part of the research process. One of the groups of people I found are connected to this sort of extended clan, the Satius Solomons family. And this chart, this family tree, was commissioned in that family in 1985. It was the 85th birthday of one member of the family, and so her children and grandchildren presented her with this very elaborate and aesthetically pleasing family tree. But I'll introduce you to some members of the family. So we looked at Chatham Square before. That was where that Memorial Day ceremony was held. And the man depicted here, Don Green, he passed away about a year and a half ago. Don Green is a direct descendant of the man whose grave he's next to, Gershom Mendes Satius, who I mentioned earlier on as the person who wrote that Columbia commencement speech, the leader of Sharif Israel during the Revolutionary War period. So Don Green is here visiting the grave of his great, 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 I think, grandfather. And in addition to meeting Don, I also met two of Don's sons. Aryeh is one of them. Interestingly, Aryeh, a 10th generation American Jew born in San Francisco in the 1980s, decided to make Aliyah. And so Aryeh lives in Israel. And in fact, a year or two before his father Don died, Aryeh and his family moved Don to Israel. So Don, ninth generation American Jew, actually died in Israel. You see here that Aryeh bears a very close, really uncanny resemblance to his great 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 grandfather Gershom Mendes Satius, and I think Arya is aware of that resemblance. It's pretty thrilling to see. This is Arya's brother Mark. Of course, this is a picture of Mark. Mark doesn't look like this anymore, but this was Mark in his late 20s, and this is another member of that same family. So I interviewed these people and asked them, about the legacy of their family history, what their family history meant to them, why it's important to them, how they interpret their American Jewish identity by through the lens of their family ancestry. I'll introduce you to some other people as well briefly here. Anita Moise Rosenberg lives in Charleston, South Carolina. Her family first came to Charleston in 1797 or so. She's posing here with her direct ancestor, Penina Moise. Penina Moise, among other things, wrote the 3 books that Anita has on her table there. Penina Moise was one of the most, as I understand it, one of the most beloved poets of the Confederacy. Interesting to point out about Anita Moise Rosenberg is that she her family never left Charleston. They got there in the 1790s, and they are still there. And that's a remarkable fact about her. And I'll say just a little bit more about that here. So here's another picture of Anita. I want to just tell a brief story in connection with that here. A few years ago, I went to a seminar on the history of Jews in the American South, and the seminar participants, there was one day that we were given a tour of the oldest Jewish congregation in Charleston, a tour of their oldest cemetery, and there were about 30 of us, and so there were 2 tour guides that we were offered, and we were told, well, you could take either, you can join either one of the 2. And I will say that I took less than 1 second to decide. I'm sure that the woman on the left-hand side was a great tour guide, but for me, there was something compelling for me about being in the presence of a flesh and blood descendant of one of these early American Jews. And so I chose Anita's tour, all of which is to say that there's a kind of enchantment, and I guess it borders on mythologizing people who are lineally descended from historical figures, at least for me. It sort of shapes my understanding and appreciation of history to be in touch with somebody who claims that ancestry. Similarly, with that uncanny image of Arye with his great 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 grandfather. All right, now the story gets more complicated when you factor in race. Keith Stokes is a political figure in contemporary Rhode Island, lives in Newport, works in Providence. Keith Stokes is somebody that was introduced to me about 5-6 years ago as somebody who has Newport Jewish roots as well as Newport Black roots. And so my conversations with Keith were fascinating because they helped to inform me about sort of something that we don't know as much as we should know about, which is that you want to study the living descendants of early American Jews, you're going to encounter people who are no longer Jews or are multiracial in their background, because if people have been in North America for 250 or 300 years, they are going to mix in with the population. The story that Keith told me basically was as follows: that there were Newport Jews who left Newport. Remember, I mentioned that in the 1820s, most of the Jews had left Newport. So 2 unmarried sisters who originally were from Newport, then they moved to Boston, then they moved to Richmond, Catherine and Slowey Hayes. They moved to Richmond to live with their brother, Samuel Hayes, and Samuel Hayes' son, Gustavus Adolphus Myers, has a liaison with a free Black woman, and the progeny of that liaison is Richard Gustavus Forrester, and Richard Gustavus Forrester's son is Richard Gill Forrester. These are 2 prominent members of Richmond's African American community in the second half of the 19th century. And then eventually these black members of the family make their way back to Newport, which is how Keith ends up having been born there. But it was a fascinating story. And when I was done talking to Keith, I asked him to point me in the direction of other relatives I could speak to because I wanted to meet more lineal descendants of early American Jews. And he said, well, you talk to these two people, Drury and Armistead Welford. They're brother and sister. They are Richmond natives. Their families have been members of the Episcopal Church in Richmond going back to, I think, just after the Civil War, but they have Jewish roots. They're connected to those same Richmond Jews that I mentioned in connection with Keith. And in fact, they are related to Keith, and they only discovered their genealogical connection to Keith about 10 years ago. And when Drury discovered, I think she stumbled upon Keith's blog about his Jewish roots. When Drury stumbled upon that blog, she wrote Keith a letter, an email saying, "Hi, hey, I'm your cousin." And so a new relationship was kindled, all of which is to say that this is a very complicated story when you factor genealogy in and when you factor the passage of 250 years. Things get complicated and fraught, and that history that we thought was so simple is no longer simple at all. Now, one of my favorite illustrations of this is in this following video, which will be the second and final video I show you.
Such an odd combination.
You'll all
on my
recognize this
father's
guy.
side of the Germany and the South. Yeah, two places that we have fought against as a country.
Yeah, right.
Oh my goodness. I hope no slaves show up on
Larry
this.
David is about to discover something he didn't know.
Now, Larry, this is another part of the 18th century.
Oh, you did it! You did it! I knew it! I knew it! Unbelievable!
Unbelievable.
Boy!
That's unbelievable.
Oh boy. Name of the slave owner! Henry Bernstein! My great-grandfather was a slave owner! Slaves, one female, age 4, mulatto, one female, age 17, mulatto. Oh, Professor, I'm so sorry.
I think that it's kind of pathetic, but also heartwarming in some weird and sort of cringeworthy Larry David way that he apologizes to Henry Louis Gates for the fact that his great-great-grandfather was a slave owner. But there you have it. It's a complicated story that many American Jews are not really ready or don't anticipate hearing and are surprised to hear. And my book is really intended to remind us that if we're Americans, our lives are going to be politically and racially and culturally complicated by virtue of having had roots in this continent going back this many years. Now, I want to conclude by explaining the book cover and the whole idea of imagination. Right. So remember the book cover, there's somebody holding an iPhone in front of a synagogue. And I'll explain what that's about before I show you that image. Here, what you have is a different image. So remember Ararat. This is the island in upstate New York that Mordecai Emanuel Noah declared as a Jewish refuge. Well, in 2012, a group of graphic artists and computer innovators and artists at the University of Toronto decided to create an augmented reality project, which would make it possible for people like these people, or you or me, to go to Grand Island outside Buffalo, New York, and using a phone or tablet to see things that aren't really there. Right. So that's what augmented reality does. So you're standing in front of a cemetery in which Mordecai Emanuel Noah is not buried. He's buried in Queens. But if you have a tablet, there's his grave. Right. And the cover image, same thing. You go to Grand Island and you walk to a certain spot and you hold your phone and there's a synagogue that isn't really there. In fact, you better watch out. The authors of the project explain, you better watch out because this is actually a golf course. And if you're not careful, if you're too busy looking at the image in your phone, you might get beamed by a golf ball. I like that reminder. I like that idea because essentially what it's telling us is that we think we're visiting the past, we think we're imagining the past, but we never really are. We're always in the present, even when we're most deeply absorbed in trying to interpret and retell history. We are living in the present. The present shapes every aspect of our experience, and we can only look at the past literally through the lens of the present. So I will close my talk there. I promised you a final slide. By the way, this is the oldest Jewish house in North America. It's the Daniel Gomez house, built in 1715. But more importantly, if you want to contact me, you can jot down this email address. I'd be happy to continue the conversation offline after my talk. But in the meantime, I'm going to stop the share because I'm hoping that people have questions and conversation. Thank you so much for your time so far.
Thank you so much, Professor Hoberman. That was such a fascinating and engaging talk. And so, again, I'll welcome those of you with questions. Please feel free to ask more. And to get us started, there's a few people who have asked about or have questioned mythology. I can't remember say, making myths and longevity, and asking whether it's a good thing defining Jews or having Jews defined as a long time in the country. Is that a good thing, and or what are the negatives of the undertaking?
I like that question. I think, right, I understand. I think I understand the question. I understand why people want to make those claims. I think I could be sort of enticed into wanting to make one of those claims if I was one of those Jews who had those roots. I think I would be probably pretty excited about it, for better or worse. I'm not sure I'd have a legitimate reason for that, but I think I would be pulled in that direction. However, I think what's problematic about it, as I mentioned before, is that um, if the most palpable and important ideas about American society and identity have to do with our ideals, right? Our beliefs, then longevity claims should really be completely irrelevant, right? It really shouldn't matter how long your family has been here. I still subscribe to the idea that the day you get off the bus or the airplane and you start living here, you become an American. And so the longevity claims tap into a desire that I think a lot of people, myself included, have to want to feel rooted in a place. But I think they are also they remind us of how precarious our ideals are, right? If longevity claims are what you need to claim legitimacy, then I think there's a problem.
Thank you. And um, uh, along those same lines, there's a number of individuals, at least three or four, have asked about congregations in the South. You had mentioned, I guess, a few in the North. KK, Beth Elohim in Charleston, and Mikveh Israel and Savannah are both mentioned in particular. I don't know if you have anything you want to add about those congregations.
Sure. I mean, those are both very important congregations. I visited both of them. In fact, one of the people I interviewed, I felt like I was running out of time and I hadn't prepared a slide, but I did interview a person whose family has been connected to Mikveh Israel in Savannah going back to I think the 1730s or 40s. Somebody named B.H. Levy. Um, and what was interesting to me there, basically both with Mr. Levy and with Ms. Rosenberg, that in both instances, their families had not only come to these southern cities in the 18th century, but their families had stayed there, right? B.H. Levy, who I interviewed in 2022, his family never left Savannah. Um, and that is remarkable. Again, it's sort of out of keep. I think that is not a typical Jewish trajectory in America or any other part of the world for our family to stay in one area for 250 or 200 years. But that was the case in these two southern congregations. There's so many other things that can be said about these congregations and their history. Of course, KKBE in Charleston is looked upon as sort of the birthplace of the Reform movement. in North America, right? There's a nascent reform sort of breakaway movement in the early decades of the 19th century. Um, so yeah, and Anita Rosenberg, that's the congregation that she's part of. In fact, much of what I know about that congregation was filtered through Anita's narratives.
Thank you. A couple of questions about continuing about synagogues. Um, where was the first Ashkenazi synagogue in North America? And similarly, were most of the early American Jewish communities Sephardic?
Well, so the founding of these communities, the earliest ones is Sephardic, but it doesn't take long. I think by the early to mid decades of the 18th century, right? That's pretty early. You have almost equal numbers of Ashkenazi people coming in. I think the oldest Ashkenazi synagogue in North America is in New York. But even, if you're thinking in the Atlantic world more broadly, the first Jewish congregation in London, Bevis Marks, their synagogue goes back to 1703, but very shortly afterwards, there's an Ashkenazi congregation. What happens, however, is that the Sephardi sort of ritual and culture is predominant. So for several generations, not for an Ashkenazi synagogue, but in cities where there's one synagogue, even if half of the members of that community are of Ashkenazi background, they're still practicing according to the Sephardi liturgy because the founders of the synagogue set it up that way, and also because there's a certain, I don't want to get too judgmental here, but there's a certain sort of elitism that is either invoked or mythologized, and people associate a higher degree of elegance with the Sephardic history, right? There's something more enticing about that for early American Jews. And even the Ashkenazi had to submit to that for a period of time.
Thank you. Um, two people have asked different questions about the omissions of Haim Solomon's story in different narratives. One person asked about Ken Burns' 8-hour series, and then another person mentioned the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And if you see this as a serious omission, and why he isn't part of these stories, if you have any idea.
Oh, okay. So, well, that's very timely comment. So, the apartment I'm renting while I'm here at the Cat Center is across the street from the Museum of the American Revolution, and I've been walking my dogs in their yard the last 3 days. But I have not been into the museum yet. And now I know I have to get in there. So I'm understanding from the question that Haim Solomon is not included in that museum. And well, I have to go see for myself. I can't comment on that because I haven't been in there, but I take the person's word for it. Um, sure. Yeah. Is that what the question was asking?
Yeah,
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 what do I think of that omission? Yeah, I
about
mean, I think that's one omission. There are other. Well, I haven't been to the museum yet, but there are other very important Jewish participants and witnesses to the American Revolution. One of whom is somebody I spoke about quite a bit today, which is Gershom Mendes Seixas, who perhaps his most daring act was, and maybe people know this, is that when the British were about to occupy New York in 1776, he was basically he had the power to decide whether Sharif Israel was going to stay in town and give a loyalty oath to the king, or whether they were going to leave town so that they wouldn't have to do that. And he made the choice to leave and fled first to Connecticut and then to Philadelphia, carrying the Torah with him, which was really a pretty bold assertion of alignment with the American Revolution. I'm guessing that if I go to the Museum of the American Revolution, I won't see that story either. But that story is certifiable.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, somebody asked if you have an idea of how many Jews lived in the colonies in 1776.
Well, we know that around 1800 there were about 2,500. So I think that the number set for 1776 is probably a little bit smaller than that, but roughly something in that neighborhood, 2000 maybe. Um, you know, many people will be aware, and I've sort of indirectly alluded to this, that if you do the early history of Jews in the Americas, some of the more interesting stories occur in connection with the Caribbean, and that is I don't really deal with the Caribbean in my book, but the Jewish communities in the Caribbean are very important and formative, and have exercise an influence for that matter over Jewish life in North America. There's so much connection between the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Curacao, and the American colonies and then states. So that's an important thing to factor in. And of course, there's Canada too, right? There is a Jewish synagogue in Montreal in the late 18th century as well.
Thank you. And a couple of people have asked about Uriah Levy and Emma Lazarus and if how they fit into the picture. If you have anything to add about those individuals.
Well, I'm just spent a few moments today writing about them in my current book. Um, of course, they come later. They are, I guess you could say they are legatees of this early Jewish American history, right? They are show up later on in the generations. The Uriah Levy story, I don't know enough about. I don't know as much about it as I want to. Um, but I think that there is certainly a story. It's a story that connects to the idea of Jews on the one hand, feeling that they have, like Uriah Levy, feeling that he has the right to assert his belongingness to American society, that he has a birthright as an American citizen, that it doesn't matter, that it shouldn't matter that he's a Jew, but then he finds out that it in fact does matter, and that's sort of an abiding theme for all of these people, right? They're very sanguine about whatever joy they find in having arrived in a place that offers them as much freedom as they have here, but they still have a certain awareness of themselves as outsiders. Lazarus, of course, comes later, but that poem, I mean, she writes many poems. I guess one thing to say in connection with her is, the poem that we all know is the New Colossus, but her poem about the synagogue in Newport is really also a fascinating document, and among other things, is seems to me to be kind of her version of sort of reinterpreting early Jewish American history, the Jewish American history of her own ancestors, sort of coming to a new discovery of her identity as a Jew in America. I recommend that poem to people as well, of course, as the New Colossus that we all know.
Thank you. A couple of one follow-up question about one of the pictures. Looking back at the American West, where and when is the picture of Solomon Bebo taken? And I guess were there Jews with peyote there? I don't know. Maybe signs of them being
Oh,
outward Jews.
okay. I don't think there are any Jews with peyote there. I think that's a safe bet. The picture is taken in the Acoma Pueblo, New Mexico. I think around 1885. And Bebo was basically, he and his brothers came to that part of the Southwest. They were store owners, but then Bebo ended up sort of assimilating to the local native community, and as I mentioned, became the sort of provisional governor of the Acoma Pueblo for a period of a year. He marries a Pueblo woman. Um, Interestingly enough, in the category of sort of mythologizing and reimagining, there's a film that was made about 10 years ago. What is it called? Moses on the Mesa, which is worth watching. It's maybe 20 minutes long. It's a narrative film that basically takes his story, particularly the story of his romance with this native woman. The film is made, like I said, maybe 2015, and definitely romanticizes the idea of a liaison between Jews and Native Americans, in the form of this romance. And I think that's an important theme for me anyway, is the tendency to romanticize is pretty irresistible. And Americans have been romanticizing as well as committing genocide against Native people for hundreds of years, and that doesn't go away. That sort of weird dichotomy is always with us.
Yeah, thank you. And the next question is actually sort of the opposite of romanticizing. A person asked, how much of a myth or negative stereotype is the idea of Jewish merchants being very involved in the slave trade?
That's a big question. I'm glad it was asked because it's an important one, and there's a lot of really kind of newly emergent scholarship on this subject, which I highly recommend. One book that came out less than a year ago, if people are interested in not so much the slave trade, but just Jews and slavery in North America, a book by Richard Kreitner called Fear No Pharaoh. I can't remember. I think it might be Harcourt. It's one of the trade publishers. It's a very readable book that tells the story essentially of six Jewish individuals at the time of the Civil War and the various positions they took on slavery. Two of them are sort of in the abolitionist camp. One of them, of course, is Judah Benjamin, who was the Secretary of War and Secretary of State in the Confederacy, and I think at one point one of the largest slave owners in his the state that he represented in the Senate, Louisiana. But as far as Jews in the slave trade go, that is it's a factor, right? Jews are slave traders, but not disproportionate to their numbers. They're slave traders in the same, more or less the same proportions that other European whites are involved in the slave trade. And so the idea that Jews fomented the slave trade, that they were, that they were captains of the slave trade, that's one more anti-Semitic canard that's fairly easily disproven. Louis Farrakhan famously promoted a book about 30 years ago that made that claim, and that claim is fairly easy to debunk. On the other hand, it's important for us to come to terms, as Larry David does, with the fact that by virtue of being seen as white people, Jews had privileges that other white people had, and if they lived in the South, one of those privileges, if you will, was the right to own other human beings. And there's certainly no evidence that Jews had any more compunction about owning slaves than any other white people did. In fact, there's not a whole lot of evidence of strong Jewish participation in the abolitionist movement. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Probably the main reason being that the abolitionist movement was predominantly a Protestant movement, and Jews felt alienated from that environment and that sphere. Also, Jews felt a very precarious status, and basically, in most situations, when they could, would try to avoid taking sides on such a fraught issue. I don't know how far that goes, but I certainly recommend this Richard Kreitner book for people who are interested in the subject of Jews and slavery.
Yeah, thank you. And in our follow-up, we can include a link to the book, and if there's any other materials
Sure.
that you think would be helpful. I
Yeah.
know a number of people enjoy follow-up. So just as we're coming to a close, I have just a couple of final questions.
Yeah.
A few people have asked about just what you teach and whether you teach these subjects to your college students, and if you want to discuss what your project is you're working on at the
Sure.
moment.
Thanks. So I teach on occasion. I mostly teach American literature, and I have taught a Jewish American literature course a few times. In a few instances of teaching that course, I taught sort of contemporary historical novels by American Jews that reinterpret some of these events, including the Ben Ketcher book I mentioned about Mordecai Emanuel Noah, a book novel by Dara Horn, published I think in 2008, sort of a Civil War, Jewish Civil War spy novel. So I've taught those books to students, but by and large, my research and my teaching don't generally dovetail. There is a newly emergent exception to that, which is that starting basically a week and a half from now, I will be teaching a history course at Yeshiva on the history of Jews and blacks in the U.S. And so, for the first time, really, I'll be teaching this exact material for an entire semester to one cohort of students. To answer your other question, the project I'm working on now really had its start with this book, and I'll try to make it brief, but essentially in that genealogy portion of the book where I interviewed people, I mentioned Aryeh and Mark Solomons. Aryeh Green, Mark Solomons, these are the descendants of Gershom Mendes Satius and other, they're also descendants of Emma Lazarus, by the way, and Uriah Levy. Um, anyway, I was interviewing those two brothers about their early Jewish American ancestors, and I asked them, besides the people I've heard about, like Emma Lazarus and Uriah Levy, is there anyone else that I don't know about that has whose example has influenced you? And Mark Solomons mentioned to me at the time, well, our great great uncle created the John Muir Trail. I don't know if people know the John Muir Trail is a 200 mile long wilderness footpath that runs the length of the High Sierra from Yosemite to Mount Whitney. And the summer before I did the interview with the two brothers, I had hiked that trail myself, uh, having no idea that the person who created the trail, who mapped it out, who did so much of the exploration that was necessary to create a footpath in the wilderness, most of which is above 10,000 feet, that this man was not only Jewish, but was a member of this storied Jewish family whose first ancestors had come to North America in the mid 18th century. So I immediately decided that that would be my next project. I'm writing about a book about him, about Theodore Solomons, and basically trying to answer the question of how does this San Francisco-born Jew, scion of this storied Jewish American family, how does he end up becoming the founder of this, really treasured wilderness footpath, whose origins go back to the founding of the Sierra Club and alpinism, the origins of alpinism in among American people. It's turning into a very interesting story, and that's why I'm here at the Cat Center is to write up the research from that book.
Thank you. It sounds very fascinating, and I'm sure many of our audience and myself look forward to learning about it. And maybe we can,
Thanks.
when that time comes, we can be in touch again
I'll be in
once.
touch for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So great. I appreciate again sharing all your expertise and tackling all these insightful questions this evening. And it's just been a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure our audience greatly enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you, everybody. I'll look forward to hearing from people. If you want to email me, please do so.
Yes, and there were a number of questions we didn't get to. So yes,
Yeah.
if we didn't get to it, please feel free to.
Feel free to follow up with me. I will get back to you, I assure you. All right. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Matt.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Becky. Thank you, Fania. Bye-bye.
Thank you.